Welcome back to Everard Junction. In this video we're going to be focusing on quite a large section of scenery that goes in front of the station area and joins on to the embankment and car park scene that I built towards the end of last year. I've just about completed what I'd like to call the first sort of stage for the scenery in this area. There's still plenty left to do, but we've got something nice to look at now, and I'll certainly be coming back in future with my job list and adding bits and pieces and doing a bit more weathering and just giving it a little bit more personality. So let's go back to early January when I started building this scene. So here we are back over at the station side of the layout, and the sort of next bit of scenery that I'd like to make a start on would be the scenery at the foot of the car park. This area is going to feature an embankment with a continuation of the canal, as per the canal round the corner of the layout that runs past the scrapyards. The idea is that this is the same canal and it's taken a bit of a turn and it's now headed over in this direction underneath the station. As you can see, I have made a start on the canal itself using some card and some matchsticks to make some relatively long lengths of canal piling so that the whole thing runs right underneath the layout just there. So if you were to get down at eye level, you would be able to see quite a long way. And as you can see there, it just keeps going and disappears into darkness. Using this bit of wood to mimic the width of a real canal boat, you can see there's plenty of room to have two boats passing in this section. It's made of a few sections of extruded foam, basically leftover loft insulation, which I've got a little stock of and I keep using for bits of scenery, and in my usual style it is removable. So what we can do is we can paint this and do all the necessary detail to it and get it looking nice. Then we can reinstall it, having done all of that work, and then we can focus on the scenery around the edges and actually glue this into position on a permanent basis. But obviously if we were to glue this into position now, trying to make any of this look any good would be extremely difficult. I'm going to put some sculpt mould in the base of the canal. This is going to make sure that it's watertight so that when we pour in the epoxy resin later on, that it's not going to leak out and cause a mess. And it's also going to provide a nice paintable surface so that we can get a nice colour for the base of the canal. The foam doesn't tend to paint all too well on its own, and it'll also give a slightly rough texture rather than it being perfectly flat as it is now. The sculpt mould in the base of the canal has now dried rock hard, and as you can see I've just sprayed over it with some burnt umber, and that's just given it a nice sort of dark, sort of murky appearance. In this section here I'll be continuing the retaining wall that runs from the terraced houses to the right, and that's just going to help tie things in from those terraced houses all the way up to the station car park. I've drilled a few holes in the wall of the baseboard so that I can screw the retaining wall into position, and that'll become more clear once I put it into place. I've been working on it quite a lot in the evenings after work, and it's reached a point now where I can put it onto the layout and continue to add bits to it over the coming weeks. So there we go, I've just installed the retaining wall and used a couple of screws to attach it to the baseboard. Basically what I've done is fit a little piece of plywood to the pillar of each section of the retaining wall where the various parts meet, and then run a screw through that piece of wood from the rear where the baseboard is, and that's pulled the wall nice and tight to the baseboard, and it certainly isn't going to go anywhere. So these retaining walls are the same retaining walls that I've used on other parts of the layout, and that is the SS52 kit from Will's Kits. It builds quite a nice retaining wall, nice sort of red brick finish, and it's very adaptable and easy to customise. So using the basic kit and then cutting various bits of it apart and changing bits and pieces, and also building a few extra bits using the Cricut Maker machine, I have managed to make a series of independent shops and units that you would typically see in a built-up area like this. As these are attached to a solid baseboard wall, and I didn't want to compromise the structural integrity of the track bed above and spend many hours thereafter doing details, what I've done is simplified the interiors of these units using photographs to portray the illusion of an interior. And as you can see, normal viewing distance, the interior sort of passes the glance test. I'm relatively happy with how that's come out. As you can probably guess, it's taken quite a while to build these, but I'm quite happy with the results. And I basically just spent a lot of time on Google Street View looking around at retaining walls and looking at the sort of retail that you perhaps might find in some of the sort of more retail areas of town. Obviously, retaining walls in many places are just small industrial units with many of the doors being completely unmarked, and it all looks a little bit run down and dodgy. But there are some places, especially in London, where there are shops and a little bit of a retail area, and you find things like greengrocers and butchers and stuff like that. So using that real inspiration from the present day and then looking at photographs and backdating things a little bit, I've done my best to portray a sort of busy retail sort of area that you might have found near a station like this in the 1980s. Similar to the high street that runs over the top of the station with the shops along that section, I've kept the sort of occupancy quite high with the shops, and the reason for that is back in the late 80s, retail, certainly physical retail on the street, was doing quite well, and there were many companies and shops and stuff all over the place. If you needed something, you had to go out to a shop and get it. The next thing I'm going to do is start working on the surrounding area leading up to this wall. That's framed things off quite nicely, and while it still needs more work, its installation means that I can sort of carry on with other stuff that's more important. So basically, I'll be building a decent sized pathway running along the edge of the retaining walls there, which will allow enough room to put figures and stuff walking along the pavement, but also give me room to put signage and various objects outside of the various shops like you would typically see. So for example, the appliance store would look quite good with some washing machines and fridges out on the street, as you typically saw back in the day. Similar to the car park, I'm going to start things off by gluing a sheet of plastic down onto the foam, and that'll just give me a nice flat base to start things off with.
Okay, so I have glued a sheet of plastic to the Celotex, so I just used some Gorilla Glue to hold that down, and then over the top of that I've started to build the paving and the road surface. The paving slabs are all laid individually, and yes, it took just as long as it looked on camera. Not a particularly fun job, but I really like the individual paving slab look, as you don't have any joints in embossed sheets of plasticard. It all looks continuous, and it has a certain element of realism associated with that. To make the paving slabs, I just use some white plasticard. In this case, I've just used some stuff from Jarvis, which I think is about something like 0.25 of a millimetre thick, something like that, so it's quite thin. I put that in the Cricut Maker machine that you've seen me use several times before on the channel, and cut out a large quantity of paving slabs on a sheet of this plasticard. Then spraying that with two different colours in this case, you end up with a load of slabs, and then I just glue those down with some plastic liquid cement glue, in this case some precision plastic glue from Deluxe Materials. As you can see over here at the station car park, once those slabs have received a little bit of weathering and some toning down, they sort of blend together quite nicely, but you can still see the individual colours. Having built quite a lot of paving in the past, it always looks a little bit dull and drab when it's all the same colour, and in this case, as you can see, by painting it two different colours, you get a nice random effect there by just mixing the slabs together in the pot, and then you get a random selection each time you lay a slab. The curbstones are made by Scale Model Scenery, and I've just cut down the height of each strip slightly to match up to the pavement I've built here, as I decided to build it a little bit shallower than I normally do, as I've been using the area of Brixton for inspiration, and certainly some of the spots I've been looking at, the pavement is very low and in some cases actually flush with the road surface. Again, having all of those individual slabs, you can see that there's variation in height and it's not all absolutely flat, and that's just what I'm going for. Very rarely, even in an area like this, will you find the terrain to be absolutely dead level. So you can see there's areas of the ground that have sunken over the years, and that just adds a little bit more realism to the scene. So looking over at the terraced houses, you can imagine once this is finished, there'll be a plywood fascia similar to that one on the right, and that will go around this whole section here and hide all of the foam. But up on top, we've got a nice sort of urban scene over there, residential properties, and some sort of small units in the retaining wall that runs behind the gardens, and then you can see how that transitions into this new scene, and I think with quite a bit more detail this area should look quite interesting with trains running past. So let's carry on working on the scene. Loads to do, probably won't be finished in this video as usual, but I'll do my best to try and get as much done as I can.
paint on the road is now dried, and I've just glued some more of the curbstones and a little bit more plastic onto the other side of the road, and this will of course form the pavement for this side. The pavement on this side is a little bit taller, being 2mm in height, so I've used 2 pieces of the plasticard, and then the third piece, which will form the paving slabs, will be glued on top and we'll get a nice flush finish. The pavement on this side of the road will also be a bit narrower than it is on this side of the road, and that's just deliberate to make things look a little bit more organic and a bit more authentic, as you rarely come across same width pavements everywhere in every street on both sides of the road. General layout on this side of the road over here is going to follow a similar trend to how the retaining wall looks near Stewart's Lane Depot in London, and that is a quite interesting sort of area where you've got units and retail in retaining walls on one side of the road, and on the other side you've got a sort of park, open sort of green area, which if you're in the right spot leads up to a nasty tower block. Now of course I don't have space to build said nasty tower block because it would be sitting about where the camera is, and that's off the edge of the baseboard, but I can still build the sort of wall or railings and have a little bit of greenery in this section here, and that will give you a nice view to these shops here and looking up onto the station itself. As I've said in multiple videos up to this point, I'm not actually copying a real place, but what I am doing is taking ideas and elements that I see in real life and think that I can squeeze into the small space on this layout, and then we can sort of combine different effects from different places to create a sort of generic town that looks somewhat plausible. So that means, unfortunately, it's time to lay yet more paving slabs. It takes a very long time, but as I've said previously, I do much prefer the look of the separate individual slabs than embossed sheets butted together, as you can always see where the joins are. So after an awful lot of cutting and gluing, I've managed to get all of the paving slabs into position on both sides of the road, and you can see I've also started to add a few road markings in a couple of places. I've also added all of the coping stones and detail to the tops of the walls and given those a quick coat of paint. You can see they're quite light in colour at the moment, but that'll all be toned down with some suitable weathering. This end as well obviously needs more work with bridge girders and brickwork just to tie everything together. To paint the double yellow lines and road markings, I like to use these paint pens as they're really useful for going around corners. The PC3M is the size that I'm using for road markings. I find it to be a reasonably good representation of what you might find in real life. Don't worry too much about the road markings being perfectly straight and absolutely uniform and perfect in the way that they are done, because in real life this is very rarely the case, and certainly once you see some road markings that are sort of 15-20 years old, they look a right mess. So these will get some weathering and some distress over them, as it's likely these double yellows very rarely get any attention from the council. I've put some double yellows at this end due to the fact that we're approaching a junction, and then as you can see they terminate here, and then we'll just descend into the usual chaos with cars parked on both sides of the road all the way down the street. I'll be installing street lights on both sides of the road using the same spacing as the street lights in real life, or at least as close as I can work it out from Google Street View. I've got some of these drains and manhole covers from Scale Model Scenery, and in a similar manner to how I've done it on various other parts of the layout, for installing the drains I've cut out a little square, as you can see there, that's the size of the drain. Just cut that out of the plastic that forms the road surface, and then that gives you a nice sort of sunken area to put the drain in, and you'll get a nice flush finish as if it's part of the street.
I've continued to prepare a few more bits of walling off of camera. This takes quite a while, but we've got various pieces constructed and I'm just slowly working my way around the area, trying to tie it into the surrounding scenes and complete the wall. So we've got the canal disappearing under the station here, and I'm going to need a brick wall on either side of that canal so it looks convincing when you look inside. And to do that, I've got some embossed plasticard from Southeastern Finecast, and in this case what I've actually done with these pieces is super glue them to some 2mm pieces of aluminium. You could also use something like MDF, but as I work as a fabricator in the trade, having access to steel and aluminium is relatively easy for me. We've got numerous offcuts at work. And it just makes things a little bit easier with regards to installation. If you tried to just put a wobbly piece of plasticard in there somewhere, it wouldn't be straight and it would be hard to make it look right. So by attaching it to a piece of wood, or in this case a piece of aluminium, it just makes things a little bit easier. As you can see, I've also done some graffiti in my usual style. There's a mix of Railtech transfers on there, combined with my own freehand graffiti, just using a very small brush. I've also cut up another section of the walling for the wheels kits, and what I'll be using that for is up the top of the street, where it gets to that junction and it goes underneath that bridge up there in the top right. That obviously needs a wall on both sides. You can see from this angle we have a wall on that side of the road, but we do not have a wall on the side of the road where the Ladbrokes billboard is. So that little section will just improve the detail over there, and I'll continue to add girders and paint things up and get things looking a bit nicer. The street lights are made by Model Signs, part of the premium range. These are a little bit different to the ones I fitted at the car park. These look a little bit more like what you would find on a typical street back in the day, and I quite like them because they've got a reasonably convincing looking sort of light lens or top to the light post. I think they look quite good. I've masked up the light lens and given the whole thing a coat of grey primer, and I've also set the height to roughly what it looks like in real life on the real road I'm using for inspiration, and that is with the light lens at approximately the top of the retaining wall. I'm also in the process of improving the walling just on this far end. It was always a little bit difficult to work out what I was eventually going to do in this particular section, and once we started the wall on the other side of the bridge with the sort of little buttress there and everything, and how it sort of links in to the bridge girder, it looked a little bit strange with the other side of the road being different. So I've added a few more bits of the Wills kit, and that's what's nice about this kit, is it's just plastic at the end of the day and you can cut it up and do what you like with it. And I'm just in the process of blending all that in, and we should have quite a nice bit of walling transitioning into a bridge. And finally, this section here, this is the last bit of walling for the car park, and of course it's painted and weathered on both sides. Still a few little bits and pieces to do, and of course a tiny bit of graffiti in a few places, and that will form the end of the car park, which should then transition quite nicely into this embankment. And hopefully you can see how we've got this sort of very old Victorian sort of looking brick walling, and then as it gets to this section here you can sort of see where, you know, it sort of blends into the embankment, and then perhaps maybe 40-50 years ago the walling continued in that style, but you can see we've got a bit of modernisation here, and some overlap brick has turned up, and it's all sort of been changed up in this car park. So we've got a little hint of the many places you see in the UK where you've got something old that sort of comes along and would have formed a much larger original structure, but then it just sort of randomly stops and there's new development that's taken over, and you've got this slightly sort of awkward section where the old and the new meet up, and that's what I've sort of tried to do in that section there.
So I've applied some sculpt mould to the area and just smoothed it out a little bit to create a slightly rough looking embankment. I've also added a flight of stairs, as you can see here. These are just cut on the Cricut Maker machine, just little squares of 2mm thick card, and then I've glued those together to form a flight of stairs. Quick coat of grey primer with a bit of Gorilla Glue underneath, and I've just placed those there, and they'll take a couple of hours to dry. So we'll keep going. As you can see with a project like this, especially if you're building an urban scene, it is very time consuming. There's an awful lot of parts to prepare in advance and cut things out, and you have little problems and little areas where you need to come up with a solution, such as over here. We've got that brick wall against the side of the canal, but you can see obviously it very clearly doesn't meet the retaining wall, and this is the sort of stuff that crops up on a regular basis when building an urban setting, so it can be very time consuming and take several days, if not weeks, to complete a scene. I'm going to turn my attention now to the brickwork in this area. We'll tie those walls together, and we'll also work on the bridge girder itself as well. I also need to finish off the paving and tie things in to the canal here at the end of the dead-end street, and I've also got plans to build something resembling a pedestrian footbridge that goes over the canal. Again, just another nice little bit of detail that perhaps adds an extra layer of interest and something else to look at. Early stages, but that's the sort of thing we're going for with regards to the bridge in this section. The aim here is to deliberately make it look as though this is a newer bit of structure compared to the surrounding brickwork. So I've got one of those Wills bridge girders. I've used lots of these on the layout, very effective, do like using those. And then above that we've got what will be a concrete lintel, and you can see I've arranged that in such a way that it ties itself with the reinforcing brickwork at the top of the old walls, to sort of give you the impression of where the sort of ground would be on that upper section. So you can see how the two structures are sort of tied together in that respect, but instead of brickwork it's a concrete lintel. So it's been a few hours and I've been slowly painting and working on the various parts. Most of it is now glued into position, and I've also sorted out a small bit of brickwork to cover up that piece of exposed woodwork that was just next to that retaining wall. I've applied some of the Deluxe Materials plastic putty to the various joints, as we've got a lot of pieces meeting in various places here, so by doing that it's just going to help tie the structure together, and I can go over it with a bit of paint afterwards once it has all dried. The joint down here will be concealed with a drain pipe in a similar manner to the rest of the walling as per the kit. So that's another load of stuff prepared and glued into place, painted and all the rest of it. Takes a very long time, but with each bit the scene slowly starts to come to life, and it's certainly worth the extra time in just adding this bit and then looking at it and going, oh, perhaps it needs that bit, and then doing that, and just sort of continuing to sort of plough through it. So the first thing is I've added a relatively low brick wall with some capping stones on top of it to just form a barrier between the sort of green sort of section and the pavement. I've added a bit more paintwork to the road, just using the sponge method that I used earlier in the video, just using different shades of grey paint to try and give a little bit more stress and variation to the road surface. I thought it looked a little bit too uniform in the previous shots, so I'll continue to work on that. It's still got quite a lot of paintwork to be added to it, and I've not added any of the patches and boulder repairs that you would likely see. I did that in the car park and I thought it looked quite effective, so I'll do a similar thing on the street here. As we get to the end of the street, you can see it sort of fades into a bit of gravel and a bit of just nasty surface where nothing is parked and nothing really gets used. Again, taking inspiration from real roads, especially in London. I've added a set of sort of railings along the end just there, just to a little bit of a nod to some health and safety. There would have definitely been something here to stop people falling into the canal, or to stop cars accidentally bumping over the edge and falling in. It's not a particularly substantial set of railings, but it is in keeping with real life. There are many places where the road comes to an end and it just literally has a very small bit of brick wall or some sort of railings, a little bit like this. Just depends on what you're going for, but it doesn't have to be too safety conscious. In future, I'll probably put a couple of bollards just along this section here, just as a little bit of an extra safety sort of barrier. The idea being that perhaps they were the only thing that was there originally, just a pair of bollards, and then later on this fence has been added just to add a little bit of extra safety for people walking past. I've added a drain pipe to conceal the joint between the retaining wall and the bridge section. That's come out quite nicely, and I've also continued to work on the canal itself, adding a few more railings and bits and pieces. I fitted the same style of railings to the inside of the canal along the side of the towpath that I did on the other side of the layout, where the canal runs underneath the layout, just to tie the two scenes together a little bit better. And it also just adds a little something for safety, as I certainly wouldn't want to be caught out walking through there and accidentally fall into the canal. Over on the steps, I've added some more railings. Those are just scratch built using a bit of brass rod, and that's still a work in progress, but you get the idea. That's the sort of thing we're going for. The foliage over on the embankment is starting to come together. Quite pleased with that. I might add a little bit more static grass, but I do quite like the sort of bare nature of that, with the sort of soil and undergrowth showing through. I've also added this pedestrian footbridge to pass over the canal and just give access for pedestrians on both sides. This is just scratch built using odds and ends such as brass rod, scale model scenery, railings, a few bits of 2mm card, and a couple of strips of wood, and a few bits cut out on the Cricut Maker machine to form a sort of prefab concrete looking bridge. Currently this is just in grey primer, and it will receive considerably more painting and weathering once I progress with more of the scene. I'm quite happy with how that looks, and you can see how it sort of ties the two sides of the scene together, and there's a logical pathway for pedestrians who perhaps want to access the station from this side of the canal. Still lots of stuff left to do, but I'm sure once the station platforms have received all of their furniture, various details, and we've got some extra low relief scenery up against the back scene behind that Class 47, I think this area will really spring to life when we reach that point. I've deliberately left the scenery up here sticking out too far, as when I put the nice plywood fascia underneath here, get that all glued into position, we can then trim this back and get a nice finish, and that should really improve the overall appearance of the scene when looking at it from a distance. Over at this end, I've continued with the girders, added the second girder into position, and just done a little bit more tidying up and paintwork on the bricks. You can see how the brickwork running down both sides of the road underneath that section really helps make the scene look a little bit more realistic. I'm tempted to add another advertising billboard over on this side. I think that might look quite good, in a similar manner to some of the real billboards that are sort of attached to retaining walls in and around Brixton, Battersea and that sort of area of South London. So after an awful lot of building and painting and gluing and waiting for things to dry, we are closing in on what I would call completion of the first stage for this scene. As you can see, I've got a little bit further with the brick wall with the grass. I've also started extending the fascia board around the edge of the layout, so I've got that small section in there, and you can see how that just tidies things up so you can't see all the nasty foam underneath the scenery. Of course, I need to glue a suitable fascia along this side and trim everything so we've got a nice finish, nice joint, but as you can see it's starting to look quite busy and there's lots of little details and bits and pieces to see, although there is still quite a bit left to do. So I'll turn my attention back to the canal section of this scene. Quite happy with how things are looking, and it certainly looks a little bit more convincing and a little bit more realistic with the various handrails in position on these stairs and things like that. I've installed a street lamp just at the foot of the stairs. It seems a logical place for a street lamp to be positioned, and certainly in the dark it creates quite a moody looking scene, and I'm really pleased with how that looks. There's currently some glue around the base of the lamp whilst the bits of scatter and stuff I've used to touch it up and blend it in dry, and once that has dried it will blend into the background. So it's now time to put some water into the canal itself. This entire section is fully sealed with plaster, and I've made sure to check everything over, make sure it's nice and sealed before we pour in the resin. To prepare, I have added some junk and some random bits and pieces to the bed of the canal in the sort of area where you might expect people to throw stuff in. These are just random bits and pieces that I've had lying around for quite a while. We've got a traffic cone from scale model scenery, a few tyres from various Oxford die-cast vehicles, as well as some bikes, shopping trolleys and other random bits and pieces that I've had lying around, and of course the Everard Junction washing machine. When I built the canal section on the other side of the layout, I focused a lot more of my time and energy into creating details and junk to put at the base of the canal, and once I'd poured in the murky water, the reality was it was very, very difficult to see, and whilst I knew it was there, it was ultimately a little bit of a waste of effort. So while I've placed some larger objects here that are going to be prominent and easy to see, for the most part, a lot of the small bits and bobs I've left out this time, as by the time the water is poured in, it's just not visible and it's a waste to put it in. For the water in this scene, I'll be using the same stuff that I've used previously, and that's the deep pour water system from Woodland Scenics, and I'll be using the murky version, as of course we're doing a nice grotty canal. The canal is relatively shallow, as per most canals in the UK, so I'm hoping that 2 packs of this should be enough for this scene. I won't go into too much detail for how to apply this stuff. The instructions make it very clear. Just follow the instructions in the box and you should be fine. So in the last clip I used the 2 boxes of Woodland Scenics Realistic Water and poured both of those into the canal. After the first pour I left it for 24 hours to dry, and then I came back the following evening and applied the second layer, and that's brought the water level up to what I'm looking for, and it also matches the canal on the other side of the layout. Whilst the resin was curing, I busied myself doing lots of other small jobs. One of those was to weather the paving slabs. I've used Tamiya weathering powder to achieve that, and I've just gone over the whole lot with a soft brush, and that's highlighted all of the joints between the slabs and applied a nice bit of sort of dirt to the surface of each slab and blended some of the colours. I've also extended the fascia board. You can see we've got a piece of ply now glued to the front of the layout, and I've trimmed the plastic back so we've got a nice join. In time I will paint all of these fascias black just to give a little bit more of a professional finish. You can see I've painted the top of the fascia board in the same sort of colour as the Canal, and the next stage of water effects will be put over the top of that, and we should get a nice blend between the fascia and the actual layout. I'm also working on a little bit of ground cover for where the towpath is, and that's still a work in progress. I've also gone underneath the layout and wired up all of the street lights so that they all switch on with the rest of the layout lighting. In time I'll add more lighting features, and as I get more lights on the layout we will of course add one or two flickering lights perhaps in a few places to simulate bulb failures and stuff like that. I've already got a couple of bulbs in various places on the layout deliberately not working at all, just for that little bit of authenticity, but a flickering bulb would also add a nice effect, and that's a popular comment in various videos, but for the time being I'm not going to bother because it will stand out too much. I don't have enough lighting for a flickering bulb to sort of blend nicely into the overall scene. It's going to be too much of a focal point and stand out too much on its own, but in time, as the lighting project continues around the rest of the layout, I'll certainly consider adding something like that. Of course it's still missing lots of details such as figures, litter, street furniture, and perhaps a little bit more sort of green stuff growing up between the slabs. That will all be added in due course, but there is going to come a point in this video where I'm going to have to stop somewhere. Next job is to add some ripples to the surface of the water on the canal, and as you can see only the washing machine is really visible in the surface of the water just there. Many of the other details have pretty much disappeared, hence my argument for not spending too much time on putting stuff at the base of the canal. Using some gloss Mod Podge and an airbrush, I'll brush some of that onto the surface of the resin just there, now it's all dried, and use the airbrush to agitate it, and we'll get some nice water ripples on the surface of the canal. There we go, just spread the Mod Podge around with a paintbrush and then agitated it with the airbrush, and you can see we've got a sort of nice rippled sort of effect in there, and that will dry completely clear and it should look quite good. Once it has dried, I'll run along the edge of the canal piling and just touch in any of the glossy areas on the side of the canal piling where it's sort of splashed up a little bit at the sides, and then it should be pretty much finished. As you can see, the Mod Podge has nearly dried, and we've got a nice sort of rippling effect in the water there, and it just breaks things up and makes things look a little bit more interesting than it just being dead flat. In addition to the small details, I've also started to place some figures around the scene, and whilst I've still got a little bit of weathering and stuff to do, I'm going to call it for this video, I think, and we'll leave it there. These figures are all 3D printed, and they come from fine scaled figures. They are quite challenging to paint, but if you've got the steady hand and the time, it's certainly worth the effort. And here we've got a chap with a can of 5 wheel silver, and he's doing a spot of graffiti. I've also started to add some junk and some rubbish around the scene. Some of this is still wet and still drying, and it will have a little bit of paint and weathering once it has dried. But you get the idea there. Just a few bits and bobs to sort of set the scene, and I've also added a little bit of grass to the cracks in the pavement. It's a similar theme as you work your way down the rest of the street. I've just added figures and junk and bits and bobs here and there, and whilst there's still lots of stuff left to do, for the most part, the sort of basic stuff is now all done. You can see there's a few things like some electrical cabinets and stuff like that. Once all this is dried, it will be given a little bit of weathering, but generally speaking, I'm quite happy with how things have turned out. So that will bring this video to a close. Hopefully it was noticeable in the video just how long some of this stuff can take. It's very rewarding and I really enjoy the process, but obviously that does take a bit of a toll on the video production, as I can only upload videos as and when I've made progress on the layout. So I'll leave you with a few running shots as usual, and I'll be back obviously as soon as I can when I've made enough progress on the next part of the layout. Of course, in the future I will be revisiting this area and just adding a few extra bits and bobs, and I've already got several ideas and a short list already written up for a few extra things that I'd like to add here. So I hope you enjoyed it, picked up perhaps a few hints and tips, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.